Welcome to another thrilling historical Western romance audiobook, Love in the Shadow of the Prairies. If you are new to our channel, we invite you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our daily releases of captivating historical Western romance stories. And if you enjoy our content, don't forget to leave a like to show your support. For our loyal listeners, welcome back, excited to have you here again. Shall we begin? Chapter 1. Gilded Cages. The scent of fresh roses and delicate lavender filled the grand Prescott mansion as the morning sunlight slanted through the tall windows, casting soft golden beams upon the marble floors. A quiet buzz of activity echoed throughout the corridors, servants scurrying about, arranging flowers, adjusting decorations, and preparing for the most anticipated event of the season, Elizabeth Prescott's wedding to Clifford Allerton. Lizzie stood before the full-length mirror in the opulent parlour, her reflection a delicate vision of ivory lace and satin. The gown, a masterpiece of fine silk and intricate beadwork, clung to her slender form, but Lizzie barely noticed its beauty. She could hardly look at it, let alone feel the excitement it was meant to evoke. Her chest tightened, the weight of her impending union sinking deeper into her soul. It wasn't the gown that made her feel trapped, it was the choice she had been forced to make. Her fingers trembled as she absent-mindedly reached for the antique cameo necklace that had once belonged to her mother, her last link to a woman she had never truly known. It was a cherished heirloom, a symbol of Prescott lineage. And yet it felt like an anchor, dragging her into a future she did not choose. With a sigh, Lizzie studied the woman in the mirror, her face a portrait of conflict. The reflection staring back at her was not the woman she imagined herself to be. No, this was a woman wearing a mask of duty, of expectation, of sacrifice. There was no trace of joy in her features, no hint of the bride she was supposed to be. All she saw was someone who had been born into a life of privilege, a life that came with too many strings attached, strings that had pulled her into this moment of no return. Footsteps approached from behind, a familiar sound that Lizzie knew all too well. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Her father, Winston Prescott, appeared in the reflection, his tall frame blocking the doorway as he stepped inside the room. His broad shoulders were squared, his face set in the stern expression that Lizzie had grown up with, the one that suggested there was no room for hesitation, no room for emotions in the face of what had to be done. "Lizzie, my dear," he said, his voice as cold and impersonal as ever. "The guests are arriving. You mustn't keep them waiting." Her stomach tightened at his tone, that ever-present air of authority that made it clear there was no option, no alternative, no room for her feelings, only the relentless march of duty. I can't," Lizzie whispered, her voice barely a murmur. She struggled to speak the words that had been gnawing at her for days, the words that had been swallowed down, buried beneath the weight of her upbringing. "Father, I don't want this, But her father's hand, firm and heavy on her shoulder, silenced her. "You don't need to want it, Lizzie. What's important is that this marriage is a strategic necessity for our family. You've been given a chance that many would die for, and you would be wise to remember that. Clifford Allerton will bring wealth, security and stability to the Prescott name. This is your duty, not just to me, but to your future, to our family's legacy." His words, so calculated and final, settled in her chest like a stone. There was no room for negotiation, no room for her voice. He had already made up his mind. There was no escape. Lizzie's gaze flickered to the mirror again, her eyes hollow with the quiet desperation she was too afraid to voice. She could feel her spirit slipping, each word from her father tightening the invisible chains around her heart. She wanted to scream, to run far away from this gilded cage, but she couldn't. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Her father's gaze softened just a fraction. He patted her hand in what was meant to be a gesture of comfort, but it only deepened her sense of helplessness. "You'll do well today, Lizzie. You're a Prescott, and you'll make us proud." He left the room without waiting for a reply. the door closing softly behind him, leaving Lizzie standing in the midst of it all. The lavish gown, the heirloom necklace, the weight of her family's expectation. But none of it mattered. She could no longer see the woman in the mirror, the woman she was supposed to become. She could only see the cage that surrounded her and the fear that gnawed at her insides, growing with each passing second. The chapel was bathed in the soft glow of candlelight, the air thick with the scent of lilacs and roses. White lace and satin ribbons adorned the pews, and the aisles were lined with delicate bouquets, their colours as pale as the anxious faces of the guests who slowly filtered into their seats. The murmur of polite conversation filled the air, but it was all a blur to Lizzie. Her world had shrunk to the space behind the heavy velvet curtains of the alcove where she stood, trembling. The sound of the wedding march echoed faintly through the chapel, the soft strains of the organ setting Lizzie's heart racing. Her hands, still trembling from the weight of her decision, clutched the folds of her gown, the fine fabric feeling suffocating against her skin. The golden lace of her wedding dress seemed foreign, heavy with the history of an inheritance she had never asked for. Each note of the song seemed to press down on her, the walls of the chapel closing in. She was supposed to be excited, wasn't she? This was the day she dreamed of. Every girl dreams of her wedding day. But as she stood in the cool shadows of the alcove, staring at her reflection in the polished wood of the door, she could not recall any moment of that supposed dream. There was no joy in her heart, no excitement, only a suffocating sense of being trapped. Her chest rose and fell with each shallow breath, her pulse hammering in her ears. Every fibre of her being screamed at her to run, to escape, to do something, anything that might release her from this gilded cage she had been placed in. But she had no escape, no way out, not unless she defied everything she had been taught. Everything she had been told was her duty. And yet she could feel the rebellion, the desperate need to break free surging inside her like a wild, untamed thing. A low voice reached her ears. The sound of her father speaking to Clifford Allerton, his words cutting through the thick silence of her thoughts. "I trust you understand the stakes, Clifford," her father said, his tone measured and cold, the way he always spoke when he wanted to impress the importance of something upon someone. "I do." Clifford's voice was smooth, self-assured, and it made Lizzie's skin crawl. The man she was about to marry. She glanced toward the chapel door, seeing his tall, imposing figure in the distance as he spoke with her father, the same charm and confidence he always carried with him in every room. "You'll have access to every resource," her father continued, his words a reminder of the deal they had struck, one that Lizzie had never been asked to be a part of. "The Prescott fortune will be at your disposal. The railroad will expand and your interests will align with ours. This marriage is crucial for both of our futures." The words felt like a slap in the face. Lizzie's hands clenched the fabric of her gown so tightly it hurt. Her heart squeezed painfully in her chest as she heard Clifford's reply, his voice even more insidious than before. "And I'm grateful for the opportunity, Mr. Prescott. You've made a very wise decision. Lizzie's position, her status, she will be the perfect piece to move this all forward." Lizzie's breath caught in her throat. Her chest tightened with a sharp, piercing agony. She hadn't heard Clifford say it outright before, but there it was in his words, clear as day. She wasn't a woman to him. She wasn't a partner, a wife, a lover. She was simply a means to an end, a pawn in the game of business that her father had already decided for her. Her father, always so resolute, so determined, had never once considered her feelings in the matter. He had been planning this from the moment Lizzie had been born, and he had never let her forget that her duty was to the family, to the name, to the wealth. Lizzie felt a rush of hot emotion. Rage, humiliation, fear. Her vision blurred, the sound of her own heartbeat drowning out the voices in the chapel. She had known, of course. She had always known that her marriage to Clifford wasn't about love or companionship, but it was one thing to feel it and another to hear it said aloud. With her heart pounding in her throat, Lizzie realized what she had to do. It wasn't even a choice anymore, it was survival. She stepped away from the alcove, her breath coming in ragged bursts. Her pulse raced, and her thoughts spun faster than she could control. She could hear the soft murmurs of the guests, the rustle of silk dresses and polished shoes, but none of it mattered. All that mattered now was that she could not walk down that aisle. She could not marry Clifford, not when she knew that this was nothing more than a transaction, a cold exchange of wealth and power. Her gaze darted to the back of the chapel, where the tall wooden doors beckoned her. Freedom. The sound of her father's voice, the low rumble of his words, still echoed in her mind, but it no longer held power over her. She couldn't do this anymore. Not for him, not for anyone. With one final shaky breath, Lizzie turned toward the door and moved silently across the room. She didn't know where she would go, but she knew she could not stay. She couldn't be part of this charade any longer. As the distant sound of the organ rose in the chapel, Lizzie opened the door to the world beyond. Unfamiliar, uncertain, but hers. And for the first time in her life, Lizzie felt the taste of true freedom, bitter as it was on her lips. No matter the cost. The night was cool, the air crisp with the kind of stillness that only came with the deep hours when the world was either asleep or unaware. The moon, full and bright, cast long silver shadows across the courtyard behind the chapel, where Lizzie stood frozen for a moment, the enormity of her decision sinking in. Her breath came in sharp, shallow gasps, the weight of her wedding gown heavy against her, a silent reminder of the life she was about to cast aside. The sound of the distant organ and the guests' murmurs from within the chapel were muffled by the sudden rush of blood in her ears, the pounding of her heart a constant reminder of the panic that gripped her chest. The bells that would soon toll and announce her fate, still echoed in her mind. Lizzie didn't have time to think, not really. There was only one thing left for her to do. She tore her gaze away from the darkened chapel doors and turned toward the stables at the far end of the courtyard. The air was thick with the scent of hay and leather, mingling with the night's chill as she hurried across the cobblestones, her feet barely making a sound on the uneven stones. Her gown, still pristine in its untouched beauty, dragged behind her in the dirt, but she barely noticed. Nothing mattered except escaping the trap her life had become. Her pulse raced as she approached the stable, her hand shaking as she grabbed the door handle. The stables were quiet, save for the rustling of hay and the soft snorts of the horses inside. The pale light from the moon filtered through the cracks in the walls, casting everything in a ghostly glow. Lizzie had to act fast, but there was no time for hesitation. A flicker of movement caught her eye, and she turned to see a stable hand, a young man no older than 19, eyeing her in confusion. His wide eyes flickered between the wedding gown she still wore and her nervous expression. The realization came to him with a sudden jolt. You're the bride," he stammered, his voice thick with surprise. Lizzie's heart hammered in her chest, but she held his gaze, forcing her words to remain steady. "I need a horse. Now." The young man hesitated, his brow furrowed in uncertainty. He glanced toward the chapel, as if expecting someone to burst through the door at any moment. But Lizzie knew there was no time to waste. She reached into the pouch at her waist, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the coins she had kept hidden for just such an emergency. With a quick motion, she pulled out a handful of silver coins and pressed them into the young man's palm. "Please," she whispered urgently, her eyes pleading. "I'll pay you more. I just need a horse. You can have it all." The stable hand's gaze flickered to the coins in his palm, then back to her face. After a moment's pause, he nodded, and without a word he turned to the row of stalls and began to untie a sturdy mare. Relief flooded Lizzie's chest, though she could feel the wild tension of her nerves creeping in as she watched him ready the horse. She had no idea where she would go, what she would do once she was free, but for the first time in her life she wasn't thinking of duty or what was expected of her. She was thinking only of the freedom that lay beyond the walls of the mansion, beyond the life she'd been born into. As the stable hand led the horse toward her, Lizzie felt a surge of both dread and exhilaration. The horse was large and powerful, its coat a sleek chestnut brown that gleamed in the moonlight. Lizzie hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward and grasping the reins, her fingers trembling. "Thank you," she whispered to the stable hand, and with a nod she swung herself onto the horse's back. The saddle creaked beneath her and she adjusted her position, trying to steady herself, feeling the weight of her gown shift awkwardly against the horse's muscles. Before she could take another breath, the chapel bells rang out, loud and clear, signalling the moment when she should have been walking down the aisle. The sound cut through the night like a sword, sharp and final. Lizzie's heart jolted in her chest as she heard the distant shouts of voices from inside the chapel. The guards had noticed, the servants were calling for her. Panic surged through her as the stable hand stepped back into the shadows, his face pale and concerned. "Go," he urged, his voice barely above a whisper, though his words rang with a sense of urgency. She didn't need to be told twice. With a quick glance over her shoulder, Lizzie kicked the horse into a gallop, the powerful mare surging forward with a burst of energy. The sound of hooves pounding against the cobblestones echoed in her ears, growing louder and louder as she sped away from the chapel, from the life she had been forced into. The wind whipped through her hair, her gown billowing out behind her like a silken sail. She could feel her heart racing in her chest, the excitement and fear flooding through her in equal measure. There was no going back. There was only the dark road ahead, stretching out beneath the endless night sky. As she glanced back over her shoulder, she saw the distant figures of the guards rushing toward the stable, their voices carried on the wind. But it was too late. Lizzie was already gone. The moonlight bathed the road before her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Lizzie took a deep breath and allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The night air was cool, and the pale moonlight bathed the landscape in a ghostly glow as Lizzie guided the mare along the narrow trail leading out of Willow Creek. The town, nestled in the valley below, was alive with the distant sounds of voices, the clink of wagon wheels, and the occasional creak of the old iron bridge over the creek. But to Lizzie, it all felt like a world far away. The cobbled streets, the grand manor where she had lived her whole life, the heavy expectations of her father, they were all slipping further and further behind her. With each step, each rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves on the packed earth, the weight on her shoulders lightened, or at least it should have. But as the silence of the wilderness settled around her, a gnawing uncertainty crept into her chest. She had no map, no provisions save a small water flask tucked into the saddlebag. Her gown, though beautiful and fine, was no more practical than a delicate flower, torn between the wind and the harshness of the wild. The tight laces dug into her ribs, and the layers of silk and lace made it impossible to sit comfortably in the saddle. Yet none of that mattered. She had never known a life like this, one where she had to rely on herself, where the rules were uncertain, where everything felt wild and unpredictable. But for the first time, it was her life to shape. Even if she didn't know how, she only knew that she could not go back, that she would not let herself be forced into a life she had no part in choosing. The horse moved steadily beneath her, its hooves clicking softly against the dirt road. But Lizzie's thoughts were far from steady. She should have planned this better, should have taken more than a few coins and a vague notion of heading west. She didn't know what awaited her out there in the wilderness, but she couldn't stop now. The cool night air bit at her cheeks, the wind tousling her hair, and she pulled the reins gently, guiding the mare up a small hill. As they reached the crest, Lizzie paused, allowing the horse to slow to a steady walk. She breathed in the crisp air and looked back toward Willow Creek, the town now just a dim outline beneath the star-studded sky. The glow of lanterns flickered in the distance, a soft golden reflection of the life she had left behind. Her heart ached. The tears she had refused to shed during the wild escape welled up again, but she fought them back. She couldn't afford to be weak. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back now. Beneath the vast sky she could hear the wind whispering through the trees, the distant call of a lone coyote, and the soft rustle of the mare's hooves beneath her. It was the sound of freedom, of possibility, and yet an overwhelming sense of being utterly alone settled into her bones. The ache in her chest spread deeper, and a familiar sting of self-doubt crept in. Was she truly prepared for what lay ahead? She reached into the saddlebag and pulled out the water flask, taking a sip to quench her parched throat. Her gaze lifted, and for a moment she stood still, staring at the starry expanse above her. She could see the distant silhouettes of the mountains far off to the west. The Rockies. She had heard stories of their beauty, their danger, their unrelenting wildness. It was toward them she was headed, though she had no plan, no destination. What would she find there? She didn't know. But it didn't matter. She was no longer that girl standing in front of a mirror cloaked in the chains of family duty. She was no longer the woman dressed in a wedding gown that had never been hers to choose. Their heart pounded as she gripped the reins tighter. For the first time she felt a deep resolve that cut through the fear. She wasn't running away from something, she was running towards something. Something undefined, untamed. A life where she could breathe freely, where she could be her own person, where she could decide what love truly meant, and where she could make her own choices without the weight of a family legacy pressing down on her every move. With a deep breath, Lizzie straightened in the saddle, squaring her shoulders against the night wind. She would not be weak. She would not let the uncertainty of the journey stop her. She would find a way to survive this wilderness, this world beyond the comfortable wall she had been raised in, and whatever came next, she would face it with courage. She wasn't sure if she would find freedom or love or even happiness, but she knew she would find herself along the way, and that was enough. With a final glance at the town she had left behind, Lizzie nudged the mare gently forward, feeling the cool night air rushing around her like a promise, and the quiet murmurs of the world falling away as she began her journey toward the unknown. Chapter 2. The Bounty Hunter's Dilemma. The thick smoke from Winston Prescott's cigar swirled in the lamplight, hanging in the air like the weight of the conversation unfolding in the study. The room was steeped in an oppressive quiet, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock against the far wall. Heavy, dark mahogany bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes, the faint smell of dust and aged paper mixing with the acrid tang of cigar smoke. A single lamp on the desk illuminated the stern features of Winston Prescott, his brow furrowed with the seriousness of the moment. Cal Donovan stood across from him, arms crossed over his chest, his face as unyielding as the weathered lines etched into his tan skin. The ex-lawman had seen more than his share of ugly situations, but this felt different. He was a bounty hunter now, and he didn't concern himself with the finer points of right or wrong. He simply did the job for the right price. But something about this case, about the man sitting behind the desk, set him on edge. Winston took a slow drag of his cigar, his eyes never leaving Cal's. The smoke curled around his thick fingers as he set the cigar down on the ashtray, a long exhale escaping his lips. "I'll make it simple for you, Donovan. My daughter Lizzie has run off. I need her back, and I need her back without anyone knowing what's happened. You understand?" Cal's gaze hardened. It wasn't the first time he'd been hired to track down a runaway, but something in Winston's voice made the situation feel more personal. He studied the man before him, the patriarch of the Prescott family, powerful, respected, but now visibly rattled. Cal had a knack for reading people, and he didn't need to be told twice that the man sitting before him wasn't used to losing control. "How much are you offering?" Cal asked, his voice low and controlled, though there was a flicker of interest in his eyes. He knew what Winston was about to say, but the weight of the reward made his lips tighten in anticipation. 100 gold coins, Winston replied without hesitation, his eyes never leaving Cal's. "And I'll cover all expenses, but I want her brought back quietly. No one is to know she's missing, understand?" Cal didn't flinch at the sum. He'd taken on bigger contracts before, but this one felt different. There was something unsettling about the way Winston spoke, like he was desperate to control everything around him, to maintain a semblance of power over the situation. Cal wasn't a stranger to desperation. He'd been desperate himself once, more times than he cared to admit. "I'll bring her back. Cal said, his voice flat. "No need to worry about that." Winston's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing more. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling another plume of smoke. The silence hung between them for a long moment, as if the weight of it had settled in both their bones. As the quiet stretched on, a flicker of doubt gnawed at Cal's gut. He wasn't a man given to sentiment or hesitation, but something about the way Winston Prescott had phrased the request didn't sit right with him. He had known men like Prescott, men who had built their lives on manipulation, on forcing others to do their bidding for the sake of their own interests. He had also known men like Lizzie, caught in the crossfire of those interests, with no way to escape. Cal felt the stirrings of something in his chest, a pang of sympathy, maybe even a twinge of guilt. Lizzie Prescott was running from something, that much was clear. No woman with the wealth and privilege of the Prescott name would simply run away unless there was a reason. And yet, here he was, agreeing to track her down like a hound after a scent. He had no illusions about himself. He wasn't some knight in shining armor, not a man to ride in and rescue a damsel. He was a bounty hunter, cold, efficient and pragmatic. But there was a part of him that couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion that Lizzie's flight wasn't just a simple act of rebellion. No, there was something more there, something deeper. His gaze flickered back to Winston, watching as the man meticulously wiped his fingers clean of cigar ash, his eyes calculating, like he had already won the battle in his mind. The desperation was still there, hidden beneath the carefully constructed layers of control. Cal could feel it like a scent on the wind. "Something's not right," Cal muttered under his breath, though he didn't intend for the words to leave his mouth. Winston's sharp eyes flicked up. "What do you mean?" Cal hesitated, then slowly shook his head. "Nothing. I'll find her." He wasn't sure why he said it. He had no intention of turning the job down, but something inside him made him wonder if this was the right thing to do. He wasn't paid to ask questions, but there were moments in a man's life when the price of gold couldn't quiet the voices in his head. "Good," Winston said, his voice colder now, the satisfaction clear in his expression. "Don't make me regret this, Donovan." With a final glance, Cal turned and walked out of the study, the door creaking softly behind him. He didn't look back. The weight of the contract hung heavy around his shoulders, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Something was wrong. And though he didn't know exactly what it was, he couldn't shake the feeling that this chase would lead him down a road he wasn't prepared to travel. As the door closed behind him, the study fell back into silence, and Winston Prescott was left alone with his thoughts. The livery stable was quiet, save for the soft rustling of hay and the steady snorting of the horses within. Cal Donovan stood in the far corner, his large hands deftly working the leather straps as he saddled his horse. The familiar smell of hay and oiled leather filled the air, the scent of this place a constant in the life he'd built since leaving behind his badge and the law. The space was a sanctuary of sorts, quiet, predictable and unassuming, just like the life he'd come to accept. He stood there for a moment, his back to the light as he worked, the shadows of the barn wrapping around him like an old, well-worn coat. His hands were steady, but his thoughts were anything but. The flicker of torchlight from the town square reached the barn's wooden doors, casting flickering shadows against the wooden beams above. Cal's mind drifted to the past. Memories of a time when the weight of a lawman's badge had felt right, had felt like it gave him purpose. But that was before the world had turned on him, before the very system he'd sworn to uphold had revealed its faults, its failures, and its dark underbelly. He thought of the faces, the criminals who slipped through the cracks, the innocents who paid for the wrongdoings of others, and the countless nights he had spent questioning his own role in a world that was nothing like he had imagined when he first strapped on his badge. Justice in the end was never as clear-cut as it seemed from the outside. It had become a game of politics and power, a game he no longer had the stomach for. With a low sigh, Cal finished tightening the saddle cinch and stepped back, eyes narrowing as his hand brushed over the worn leather of the saddle. He had thought once that he could change the system, that he could make a difference, but that hope had died with his resignation. Now he was just a man trying to survive, trying to make a living in a world that had long since abandoned any ideal of right and wrong. This job, tracking down Lizzie Prescott, was just another business deal, nothing more. The 100 gold coins Winston Prescott had offered him dangled before his mind like a tempting carrot. It was enough money to settle all the debts he had left lingering over him, enough to keep him going for months, maybe longer. A simple contract. Find the runaway bride, bring her back to her father's grasp, and move on. And yet, there was something about the way Prescott had spoken about Lizzie, about the cold detachment in his voice, that left a sour taste in Cal's mouth. He'd seen it before, the way rich men treated the lives of others like pawns in some grand game, the way they used people for their own gain. It was clear that Lizzie was just another piece on a chessboard, one that had been moved without her consent. But that wasn't Cal's problem. His problem was the debt. The hours of wandering through dusty towns with little more than his name and his reputation to get by. He had a job to do, and he had to focus on that. He had no room for moral quandaries. Not anymore. As he swung himself into the saddle, the leather creaked beneath him, and the mare beneath him gave a soft snort of irritation. Cal patted her neck, urging the horse forward with a gentle nudge. He had his orders, and though a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a simple case, he knew he had to push that aside. The night air was cool against his skin as he rode out of the stable and into the moonlit streets of Willow Creek. The town lay still, quiet in the darkness, with only the distant hum of a few late-night conversations and the faint sound of a piano drifting out from the saloon. He could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, the thick silence of the world wrapping around him like a blanket. A man stepped into his path, holding up a hand to stop him. Cal slowed the horse to a trot, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the man from the local inn. A witness, no doubt, someone who had seen something, who might know where Lizzie had gone. "She went west," the man said, his voice low and rough as if the words themselves were reluctant to leave his mouth. "Saw her headin' toward the foothills. No one else saw her, but she was makin' good time. Reckon she's looking to disappear." Cal nodded, the tight knot in his chest only loosening a little. He had his lead. The foothills of the Rockies. That was all he had to go on. Without another word, Cal spurred the mare forward, the horse's hooves clipping steadily against the packed dirt as he rode into the darkness. The shadows stretched long around him, the distant mountains looming like a promise of things to come. His thoughts flickered to Lizzie Prescott, her pale, determined face flashing in his mind. She was running, and for reasons he couldn't yet understand, Cal found himself wondering if she had more courage than most people he knew. But none of that mattered now. He was on the hunt, and once he found her, he'd bring her back, collect his payment, and leave. The rest was none of his concern. The only thing that mattered was the chase. The sun had barely begun to creep over the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains, casting the world in a pale golden light. Lizzie's breath came in shallow bursts, the cool dawn air biting at her cheeks as she urged the horse forward along the narrow trail. The ridge stretched ahead, winding its way up into the foothills, its craggy edges jutting out like teeth against the soft sky. The silence of the early morning, broken only by the soft clip of hooves and the rustling of leaves, was a far cry from the noise and chaos she had left behind in Willow Creek. But despite the beauty of the scene, her heart pounded with an unsettling mix of fear and exhilaration. She had no map, no destination, only the vague notion that somewhere in the wild expanse of the mountains she could find something, anything. That wasn't the life she'd been forced into. Her horse moved cautiously along the edge of the ridge, its hooves clipping against the loose rocks and dirt. The path was treacherous, narrow and winding, the steep drop to the valley below enough to send a shiver of dread crawling down her spine. Every step felt precarious, like the ground beneath her might give way at any moment, sending her tumbling into the abyss. The wind had picked up, and the trees on the far side of the trail rustled ominously, their branches creaking in the rising breeze. Lizzie's gaze flickered nervously to the horizon, the mountains looming like silent sentinels in the distance. but her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, sharp sound, a crack, followed by the unmistakable rumble of shifting rocks. Before she could react, the earth beneath her horse's hooves seemed to tremble, and with a violent snort the mare reared back, throwing Lizzie off balance. "Steady, girl, steady!" Lizzie shouted, her fingers digging into the reins as the horse reared again, its hooves pounding the air. In the next instant, a rock slide rumbled down the slope to her left. Loose stones and jagged boulders tumbled down the mountainside, crashing with a deafening roar as the mare panicked, her eyes wide with terror. The horse, thrown into a frenzy, whinnied and jerked violently to the side. Lizzie, caught off guard, was thrown forward, her arms instinctively reaching for the horse's mane as the ground beneath her seemed to give way. Time seemed to slow as the world tilted, the jagged edge of the ridge dropping away beneath her. The mare, its legs scrambling for purchase, began to tip toward the slope, its hooves sliding on the loose rocks. "No!" Lizzie screamed, her heart racing as she fought to regain control of the horse. Her fingers slipped from the reins for a split second, and in that moment she felt the terrifying pull of gravity. But just as it seemed the mare would tumble, a strong hand shot out of the chaos, grabbing the bridle of the horse with a force that yanked it to the side. Lizzie cried out as the sudden movement nearly knocked her from the saddle, but the hand held firm, steadying the frightened animal. "Easy now," a voice growled from somewhere above her, low and commanding, but there was no mistaking the urgency in it. She gasped, blinking in confusion as the man's form emerged from the shadows of the pines lining the ridge. His dark eyes locked onto hers with a hard intensity that made her heart stutter. It was him. Cal Donovan. She hadn't heard him approach, but now that he was here, he was a solid presence, his rugged figure filling her vision as he gripped the mare's bridle, holding it steady. His broad chest rose and fell with the effort as he carefully maneuvered the horse back onto the ridge, his hand never leaving the animal's face. "You're safe now," he said, his voice as steady as the hand he kept on the reins. "But you nearly took a dive off that cliff." Lizzie's breath was coming in shallow bursts, her chest tight with the aftershocks of fear. Her fingers trembled as they clutched the reins again, her mind still reeling from the panic. She hadn't seen him approach, hadn't even heard him until he was right there, saving her from the brink of disaster. Her heart still hammering in her chest, she turned to him, her voice shaky. "What are you doing here?" Cal's eyes never left the mare as he eased the animal back onto solid ground, his movements deliberate. "Looks like I'm just in time," he muttered, his jaw clenched in concentration. "Don't know what you were thinking, riding a ridge like this in the dark. You could have killed yourself." Lizzie's mouth went dry. She couldn't seem to form a coherent thought. She'd never been so frightened in her life, and yet, as his large hands steadied the horse, she felt a strange flicker of gratitude beneath the anxiety. There was something about his presence, something raw and confident, that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't entirely alone in this wild world. He looked at her then, his gaze flickering over her face, assessing her. "You all right?" She swallowed, nodding quickly even though she wasn't entirely sure she was. Her heart still raced and her breath was shaky in her chest. She was alive, but she wasn't certain she felt safe yet. "I'm fine," she said, her voice a little too sharp. "Thank you." He didn't respond right away, and for a long moment there was only the sound of their breaths and the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. Then, with a grunt, he took a step back, letting the reins fall into her hands. "You're lucky I was nearby," he said, his tone gruff, but there was something in the way he looked at her, something she couldn't quite place. He wasn't a man to offer unnecessary sympathy, but the flicker of something deeper in his eyes made her wonder what was really going through his mind. "I don't need luck," she replied, her voice stronger now, though it still held a trace of her earlier panic. "I can take care of myself." Kel studied her for a moment, his lips pressing into a thin line. "We'll see about that," he muttered, then turned to mount his own horse as if dismissing the conversation entirely. Lizzie clenched her jaw, unwilling to acknowledge the sharp pang of irritation that shot through her at his words. He was right, of course. She had been reckless. But she wasn't about to admit that, not to him. With a glance over her shoulder, she followed Cal's lead, spurring her mare back onto the trail. The distant peak still called to her, but the trail ahead now seemed even more uncertain than before. And yet, despite everything, Lizzie felt a strange, inexplicable sense of connection to the rugged man at her side. Something about him, his strength and quiet resolve, made her think that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't been entirely alone in this wilderness after all. The soft trickle of the stream filled the quiet of the early morning, its gentle murmur a soothing contrast to the chaos of the night before. The pale light of dawn broke through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground where Lizzie sat, her knees drawn to her chest, arms wrapped tightly around them. The coolness of the morning air nipped at her skin, the faint scent of pine and damp earth drifting through the campsite. Cal Donovan was busy tending to the horses, his movements efficient, practiced. He made no attempt to speak, nor did Lizzie offer him any words. They both knew the nature of this fragile truce, silent, temporary, and steeped in mutual distrust. Cal had saved her life, but he was also here to bring her back to her father, to collect a bounty that Lizzie could not ignore. The weight of that knowledge pressed heavily on her chest as she watched him. He was a rugged man, his features weathered by years of living in a world that demanded strength over softness. His broad shoulders and lean, muscled frame spoke of someone used to hard work, and his hands, though gentle with the horses, were calloused from a life of labor. His dark eyes, focused on the task at hand, never strayed toward her, and Lizzie couldn't decide if she was relieved or irritated by that. She shifted uncomfortably, her gaze narrowing on him. It had been a mistake, hadn't it? A mistake to trust him, to let him save her. She hadn't asked for his help. She hadn't wanted it. Her only desire was to escape, to leave everything behind and find freedom. But now, here she was, trapped in this uncertain alliance, tied to a man who owed her nothing but a job to finish. She swallowed hard, the weight of the situation settling deeper. The quiet serenity of the campsite only made the reality of it more unbearable. She was alone with him, and the trust that had once been so easily given now seemed a distant memory. Finally, Cal spoke, his voice low but clear as he approached her, wiping his hands on the rough cloth of his shirt. "We should head to the next settlement. It's not safe for you to be out here alone." He paused, his gaze briefly flicking to hers. "I'll take you there. After that, you can go your own way." The words sent a jolt through Lizzie, her pulse quickening. "You mean, I'll go back to my father?" she said sharply, her voice tight with restrained anger. "That's what you really want, isn't it?" Cal didn't flinch at her accusation. He simply nodded as though he were stating a fact, not a preference. "I'm doing my job, Lizzie," he said evenly, his expression unreadable. "You're a runaway. Your father wants you back. I'll take you to him whether you like it or not." The realization struck her like a physical blow. There was no escaping it. She had hoped in the deepest recesses of her mind that perhaps he had seen something in her struggle, some shred of a person who deserved more than just a return to a life of control and expectation. But Cal's words were cold, and in them she heard the sharp edge of truth. She was nothing but a job to him. The bile of resentment rose in her throat, but she kept it down. No, she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. She wouldn't let him see how much his words stung. But still, the part of her that had fled from Willow Creek, the part of her that had longed for freedom, whispered that she wasn't yet defeated. She could find a way out of this. She had to. Her gaze flickered toward the horses as they grazed quietly nearby. "And if I refuse to go with you?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous, the threat of defiance clear in her tone. Cal's gaze met hers, dark and steady. "You don't have much of a choice, not out here." He gestured toward the dense woods surrounding them. "You're not equipped to survive this wilderness on your own." She bit her lip, her fingers clenching around the worn fabric of her dress. He was right. She wasn't prepared for the harshness of the land, for the wildness of the trail she'd chosen. She had no survival skills, no provisions, and no plan beyond escape. The cold reality of it pressed in on her with each passing second. but she wasn't ready to admit that defeat yet. "I can still try," she muttered, mostly to herself but loud enough for him to hear. Cal didn't respond immediately. His eyes lingered on her for a moment, the faintest trace of something unreadable passing between them before he spoke again. "You can try all you want, Lizzie," he said softly, almost as if talking to himself. "But you'll be out here alone, with no way to get anywhere. You'll be running in circles until you run out of strength." Lizzie shifted, the sharp sting of her own helplessness driving her to speak. "I won't go back," she said more fiercely than she intended. "I won't be a pawn in my father's game. I won't let him decide my life any longer." The words hung in the air between them, both an admission of fear and defiance. Cal stood silently for a long moment, the early sunlight catching the dark lines of his face, casting his features in sharp relief. His mouth tightened, and for the first time Lizzie saw a flicker of something like understanding. Or maybe it was just the briefest trace of something else, something more personal. "Then let's make sure you don't end up dead in the middle of nowhere," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Ride with me to the next settlement. I'll get you there and we'll figure it out from there." Lizzie hesitated. The thought of trusting him, even for a short while, gnawed at her. But the truth of the situation was undeniable. She was alone. She had no choice but to take the chance, to accept this uneasy alliance, if only for the time being. "I'll go with you," she said, the words leaving her mouth reluctantly. "But don't think for a second that I'm doing this because I trust you." Cal gave a short, humourless laugh, his eyes flickering with something like amusement. "I don't expect you to." And so, with nothing but the wild unknown ahead of them, they mounted their horses and set off once more, an uneasy silence stretching between them as the path wound forward. Despite their wariness, there was an unspoken understanding that passed between them, a flicker of recognition in the way they each moved, calm, determined, self-reliant. Neither of them had the luxury of softness. Both were scarred by the world in their own way, and as the sun rose higher in the sky, Lizzie couldn't help but wonder if, despite the tension that clung between them, they might both be looking for something deeper, something that neither of them had quite realized they were missing. Chapter 3. On the Mountain Trails. The sun had barely crested the mountain peaks when the morning air turned cool and crisp, a refreshing breeze filtering through the dense pines. Lizzie and Cal rode slowly, their horses' hooves muffled by the carpet of pine needles beneath them. The dense forest seemed endless, the towering trees stretching high above them, their boughs rustling softly in the wind. Lizzie could feel the stillness of the forest surrounding her, the quiet broken only by the occasional chirp of birds and the far-off sound of a stream rushing through the woods. As they made their way deeper into the forest, Cal signaled for them to stop. They dismounted, letting the horses rest for a moment as they both surveyed their surroundings. Lizzie's shoulders were sore from the previous day's ride, her body stiff from the long journey, but she said nothing. Cal's silent command had her falling into step beside him, following his lead as always. He walked over to a nearby tree, crouching down as he began to collect a few twigs and thin branches. Lizzie watched him, curiosity piquing as he worked with the ease of someone accustomed to the wilderness. He was methodical, his large hands moving deftly despite the roughness of the terrain. "What are you doing?" Lizzie asked, her voice hesitant but intrigued. She had been raised in a world where survival didn't require such knowledge, where food came from a kitchen and comfort from luxury. Cal glanced over at her, his expression unreadable. "Setting a snare. We'll need to eat soon, and this is the quickest way to catch something." Lizzie hesitated, her gaze flicking between the snares and the man in front of her. He was so sure of himself, so confident in what he was doing. It was as if the woods were a familiar companion to him, and she was nothing more than a visitor in its vastness. "Do you really think we'll catch anything?" Lizzie asked, unable to keep the skepticism out of her voice. She had no doubt that Cal could survive, but she wasn't so certain about her own skills, or lack thereof. "We'll see," Cal said, his voice calm and steady. He handed her the rope he had gathered, demonstrating how to tie it to a nearby tree in a loop, securing it to the small snare he had built. Lizzie took the rope, fumbling at first with the knot, but eventually managing to tie it as he instructed. She tried to match his ease, but the unfamiliarity of the task made her feel awkward and unsure. Still, she didn't want to appear helpless. "That's good enough," Cal said, offering a small nod of approval as he looked over her work. It was an unexpected praise, and Lizzie felt a surge of gratitude mixed with the smallest bit of pride. She had done it, and for the first time since they had begun this journey together, she felt like she was contributing, doing something worthwhile. After securing the snare, they sat beside the campfire and shared a small meal, the scent of roasted rabbit filling the air. Lizzie had always imagined the wilderness to be a place of hardship and danger, but now, in the early morning light, as she sat beside Cal, a quiet sense of peace seemed to settle over her. The birds chirped overhead, and the crackle of the fire was comforting, not threatening. Lizzie took a small bite, glancing over at Cal as she chewed. He was sitting across from her, staring into the fire, his face half-shadowed by the flickering light. She had grown used to his silence, to the way he always seemed to be lost in his own thoughts, but she found herself wishing, just for a moment, that he would share those thoughts with her. He was a mystery to her, as silent and elusive as the mountains surrounding them. "How long have you been out here, like this?" she asked, her voice quieter now. She wanted to know more about him, about the man who had saved her life and now guided her through the wilderness. She had never asked before, but now the question lingered in her mind. Cal looked up from the fire, his dark eyes meeting hers for a brief second before he turned his gaze back to the flames. "A while," he said, simply. "I used to be a lawman, but that life didn't suit me, so I left it behind. Figured this was a better way to make a living." Lizzie nodded, sensing there was more to the story, but not wanting to push him further. She could tell there was something buried deep within him, something he had long since closed off. She could feel it in the quiet tension that lingered around him, in the way he never spoke of his past with any great detail. She didn't blame him. Perhaps some things were better left unsaid. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the tension between them easing just a little. There was no need for words. The simplicity of the moment, the shared meal, the warmth of the fire, was enough. For the first time, Lizzie felt a sense of connection that wasn't tied to duty or obligation, a quiet understanding that passed between them without being spoken. After a while, Cal stood, stretching his long limbs. "We'll need to keep moving," he said, his voice steady as he packed up their things. "We'll be in a better position to find supplies if we reach the next settlement before nightfall." Lizzie nodded, the weight of the journey settling over her once more, but there was something in his calmness, in the way he moved with purpose, that made her feel like they could get through this together. And despite the wariness she still felt toward him, despite the mistrust that lingered, she couldn't help but feel a strange flicker of gratitude for his quiet strength. They packed up their campsite in silence, and as they mounted their horses to continue the journey, Lizzie couldn't shake the feeling that, for all their differences, they were bound together in ways neither of them truly understood. By late afternoon, the trail had begun to wind higher into the foothills, the rocky ground giving way to scattered boulders and uneven terrain. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the mountain peaks and the jagged landscape below. Lizzie and Cal rode in silence, the distance between them growing as the landscape seemed to close in around them. The trail was steep here, forcing them to slow their pace, and Lizzie found herself thinking more than she would have liked. She hadn't meant to come this far. She hadn't meant to rely on Cal or trust him as much as she had, but there was a certain steadiness to him, an unspoken promise that he would keep her safe, even if he didn't show it in words. Finally, as the trail opened up into a rocky clearing with a breathtaking view of the mountains stretching out before them, Lizzie stopped. She dismounted, walking toward the edge of the clearing where the sun bathed the landscape in warm light. She stood there, her breath catching in her throat as she took in the vastness of the wilderness surrounding them. It was beautiful in a way that left her feeling small, insignificant. Cal followed her, his boots crunching against the stones beneath him. He stood beside her, his gaze following hers as he studied the view in silence. "Why did you run, Lizzie?" he asked softly, his voice breaking the quiet of the moment. She looked at him, startled by the question. She hadn't expected him to ask, not now, not here. She wasn't ready to fully explain herself, but the weight of his gaze seemed to demand honesty. "I didn't want to marry him," she said quietly, her fingers tightening around the reins of her horse. "I didn't want to be trapped in a life I didn't choose." Cal's gaze softened, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes, a flicker of understanding. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by the stoic expression she had come to expect from him. "I understand that," he said, his voice low. "I left my own life behind for similar reasons. The law, it wasn't what I thought it would be." There was an honesty in his words, a shared understanding between them, and Lizzie felt her walls slip a little. She didn't know what to say, but before she could find the right words, she stepped backward, her foot brushing against a sharp stone. She winced, and as she reached down to rub her heel, a sharp pain shot through her hand. "Here," Cal said quickly, stepping forward to help. He took her hand gently in his fingers brushing against her skin as he inspected the thorn embedded in her palm. A sudden rush of warmth spread through her, her breath catching as his fingers lingered, brushing against her skin. She glanced up at him, and in that moment their eyes met, and there was a tension between them that hadn't been there before. Cal's fingers were gentle, his touch sending a strange thrill through her that she couldn't quite explain. She felt her heart race, her breath quickened, and for a brief second it seemed as if the world around them had fallen away. Without a word, he carefully removed the thorn, his touch lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. Lizzie stepped back, the sensation of his touch still lingering in the air between them. Neither of them said anything, but the spark that had ignited between them was undeniable. It was there, in the space between them, in the way their eyes met for a fraction longer than they should have. "Thanks," Lizzie murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Cal nodded, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something she couldn't quite place, that made her wonder if they were both starting to see each other in a different light. The distance between them had shifted ever so slightly, and as they remounted their horses and continued down the trail, Lizzie couldn't help but wonder if their journey together might hold more than just survival. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, as Lizzie and Cal arrived at the small trading outpost nestled just beneath the treacherous mountain pass. The sun had dipped low behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the landscape, and the temperature had begun to fall with the fading light. The outpost, a humble wooden building perched precariously near the cliffs, looked almost as weathered as the people who lived and worked there. Its crooked sign swayed slightly in the wind, and the low murmur of conversation mixed with the soft clatter of the telegraph machine inside. Lizzie dismounted, her muscles sore from the long ride, but the thought of a roof over her head for the night brought a small sense of relief. She had barely spoken to Cal all afternoon, the tension between them thick with unspoken words. He had not forced any conversation on her, respecting her silence, but Lizzie knew that the space between them was growing, an invisible gulf of things they couldn't yet say to each other. Inside the small outpost, the dusty floor creaked underfoot, and the smell of ink and paper mixed with the earthy scent of the wilderness. Lizzie stepped inside, her gaze sweeping over the few scattered shelves and barrels of supplies, her eyes eventually landing on the counter where the shopkeeper, an older man with a scraggly beard, stood sorting through papers. Behind him, the telegraph machine clicked and clattered, sending out its messages to parts unknown. Lizzie's attention was drawn to a stack of papers resting on the counter beside him, and her heart skipped when she saw the familiar crest at the top of one, Prescott Enterprises. Without thinking, she moved closer, her pulse quickening. The paper had clearly been meant for the shopkeeper, but something, some impulse, some instinct, drove her to pick it up. The telegram, once folded, was now creased with age, and Lizzie's fingers trembled as she unwrapped it, trying to keep it hidden from view. Her eyes scanned the words quickly, her heart tightening as she read. Winston Prescott. To Railroad stakeholders. Subject: urgent financial update. The telegram was addressed to the very men who held power over her father's business, the men who had placed so much pressure on him to continue the railroad's expansion. As Lizzie read, her breath caught in her throat, and her world seemed to tilt on its axis. "It is imperative that my daughter marry Clifford Allerton immediately," the telegram read. "The future of the Prescott fortune depends on this union. Without it, we risk bankruptcy and the collapse of Prescott Enterprises. If the wedding does not proceed, the family business will fall into ruin and the railroad's future will be uncertain. Your cooperation in ensuring this matter is expedited is essential." The words blurred in front of her as she read them again, the meaning sinking in like a cold stone in her chest. Lizzie felt the ground beneath her feet shift, the very foundation of her resolve crumbling. She could feel the weight of the message pressing down on her shoulders, the knowledge that her entire family's fortune was tied to her marriage to Clifford. Her pulse hammered in her ears as the implications settled over her. She wasn't just being forced into a marriage for social standing for the sake of a family legacy. No, this was a matter of survival. Her father, the man who had always demanded that she uphold their name, had gambled their entire future on her unwilling participation. If she refused, the collapse of everything, the business, the railroad, the Prescott name, would fall squarely on her shoulders. A sharp breath escaped her lips as she folded the telegram back up, the weight of her decision pressing down harder than ever. She had run away, thinking she could escape the life that had been chosen for her, but in the end she realized with painful clarity that the freedom she had longed for had come at a cost too high to bear. She was tied to her family in ways she hadn't fully understood. She turned away from the counter, clutching the telegram tightly in her hand, but not before her gaze flicked to the door. She could feel Cal's presence in the doorway, could sense his steady, unreadable gaze on her. The briefest flicker of sympathy crossed his face as he watched her, but it was gone almost immediately, replaced by the familiar wariness. Lizzie's throat tightened as she stepped out of the building, the weight of the telegram still heavy in her hand. She had known it wasn't just about her. She had known that her family had never truly seen her as anything more than a tool, a piece to be moved. But now it was clearer than ever. Her choice, her desire for freedom, had never really been an option. The small cabin they had rented for the night was cramped, its wooden walls cracked with age. The oil lamp flickered softly on the small table in the corner, casting long shadows across the room. Lizzie sat on the edge of the bed, her legs pulled beneath her, her hands wringing nervously in her lap. Cal sat across from her in the chair near the table, his eyes narrowed, his jaw tense with the quiet understanding that something had shifted within her. The sound of the wind outside was muted, but Lizzie could still hear the soft rustling of the trees, the same feeling of isolation that had gripped her since the moment she left Willow Creek. She had never felt more alone, even with Cal in the room. But the secret she carried, the truth that now hung between them, was too heavy to keep locked away. Cal's voice broke the silence, low and calm. "You've been quiet since we left the outpost. What's going on, Lizzie?" Her breath hitched in her throat, but she didn't look up at him. She couldn't, not with the weight of everything pressing down on her, but she couldn't stay silent any longer. "I read a telegram at the outpost," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was from my father. He's in trouble, Cal. The business is failing. If I don't marry Clifford, my family will lose everything." Cal sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable as he processed her words. There was no judgment in his eyes, just the steady, calculating calm she had come to expect from him. But inside, Lizzie felt as if everything was unraveling. She wasn't just fighting for her own future, she was trapped in a game that involved her entire family's survival. "I didn't know," she continued, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was running away from a life I didn't want, but it's not just about me anymore. If I don't marry him, everything falls apart. The railroad, my father's business, everything." Cal stood then, walking to the small window, his back to her. Lizzie couldn't read his expression, but she could feel the weight of his silence, the tension in the air. "I never asked for this," she whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I wanted freedom, but now I'm caught between my duty to my family and the life I wanted. I don't know what to do, Cal. I don't know if I can go back." His voice, when it came, was quieter than she expected. "You don't have to go back," he said softly, turning to face her. "But you can't carry this burden alone, Lizzie. You've got choices, even if it doesn't seem that way." She looked up at him then, her heart aching with the rawness of her confession. "But how? How do I make a choice when my family's future is at stake?" Cal's expression softened, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "You'll find a way. You just need to trust yourself." The room seemed to grow smaller as their eyes locked, and for a moment it felt like the space between them had narrowed, the air thick with something unspoken. Lizzie's breath caught in her throat as she met his gaze, the tension palpable, yet comforting in its familiarity. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. And in that realization she found the courage to face the road ahead, no matter how uncertain it was. And with that, for the first time since she had left Willow Creek, Lizzie felt a flicker of hope, a spark that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way out of this tangled mess. Chapter 4. Pressing On. The early morning air was crisp with the bite of the mountains, the thin light of dawn creeping over the peaks, painting the sky in soft hues of gold and lavender. The trail ahead was steep, winding upward into the distant ridges where the high-altitude trees grew thicker and the air seemed to thin, making each breath more precious than the last. Lizzie felt a certain exhilaration at the sight of it all, the sheer vastness of the world around her, and a deep sense of relief in the quiet that surrounded them. She stood beside their small campfire, now reduced to smouldering embers, her fingers tightly gripping the reins of her horse. The exhaustion of the past days weighed heavily on her, but there was something else stirring within her, a force that urged her forward. It was the desire to keep going, to find something, anything, that resembled a life she could call her own. Cal, packing the remaining supplies onto his horse, glanced over at her. His movements were slow, deliberate, yet his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than usual, as though weighing something in his mind. She met his eyes, her expression determined but weary. "I want to keep moving," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. The idea of stopping at this outpost with its fleeting comfort was suffocating. She couldn't stay here, not when there was more to discover, not when her own future seemed so painfully out of reach. Cal raised an eyebrow, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he were reading something more in her words. He said nothing at first, merely securing his gear with practiced hands, but then he nodded slowly, understanding her need to press on. "I figured you'd say that," he said with a slight smile, his gruff voice carrying the slightest warmth. He swung up onto his horse and looked down at her. "All right then, we'll head up to higher ground. But it's no easy ride from here." Lizzie smiled, the corners of her mouth pulling up just slightly. "I'm not afraid of a challenge," she replied, the fire of determination burning brightly behind her eyes. A subtle understanding passed between them, as if they were finally beginning to see each other more clearly. Her stubbornness, her willingness to keep moving, to keep seeking something beyond what she knew, had earned his respect, and she, in turn, recognized something in him, something beyond the bounty hunter, beyond the man who was simply doing a job. There was a quiet strength in him, an unspoken promise that he would help her, no matter how impossible her journey seemed. They packed the last of their supplies in silence, the weight of the unspoken bond between them settling like a heavy cloak around their shoulders. Lizzie reached for the last bundle of blankets, her fingers brushing cowls as they both reached for the same item. A brief, quiet spark passed between them, a brief moment of tenderness that was quickly masked by the harshness of the trail ahead. Neither of them spoke of it, but they both knew it was there. Something unspoken, something deepening between them that neither could quite name. Finally they mounted their horses, and with one last glance at the small outpost, they turned their backs on it and began the slow climb up the mountain trail. The sun had fully risen now, and the light cut through the towering pines, casting long, shifting shadows across the path. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. Instead, it felt like a shared understanding, a silent agreement that they were in this together, no matter how uncertain the future seemed. The trail narrowed as they ascended, the path winding between thick trees and rocky outcrops. The air grew cooler, the scent of pine thick in Lizzie's nose as they made their way through the dense forest. She tried to keep her thoughts focused on the task at hand, on the next step, the next mile, but her mind kept drifting to the past, to the life she had left behind. The haunting image of her father's face, the weight of his expectations loomed large in her mind, but she pushed it aside. She couldn't go back. Not now. Not ever. Suddenly the stillness of the morning was shattered by the sharp crack of branches snapping, the sound of hooves pounding against the earth. Lizzie's heart lurched, her body tensing as her gaze shot to the trees ahead. From the shadows 3 men emerged, their faces shadowed beneath wide-brimmed hats. Their eyes locked on her, and for a moment everything else seemed to fall away. One of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered figure, grinned in a way that made Lizzie's blood run cold. "There she is," he called out, his voice rough, taunting. "Clifford's bride, running from her duty. You really think you're going to get away with it?" Cal's jaw tightened as he pulled his horse to a stop in front of Lizzie, positioning himself between her and the approaching men. The 3 men's rifles gleamed menacingly in the sunlight, the tips pointed directly at him. "You'll regret this, Donovan," the man called out again. "Clifford doesn't take kindly to thieves." Lizzie's heart pounded as she watched the situation unfold, the tension thick in the air. These men weren't here to negotiate. They were here to bring her back, to drag her kicking and screaming if necessary. She felt a deep, visceral fear rise up within her, but she refused to show it. She would not be broken, not by these men. Cal didn't flinch. He sat still on his horse, his hand hovering near the revolver at his side. "You don't want to do this," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. "Turn around and head back the way you came. I won't warn you again." The men laughed, the sound rough and ugly. "You're outnumbered, Donovan," the leader sneered, cocking his rifle, "and I don't think you've got much say in the matter." Before Lizzie could react, Cal's hand moved, quick as lightning, drawing his weapon and firing at the man closest to him. The shot rang out, and the man let out a grunt of pain as he staggered back, clutching his arm. The other 2 men cursed and returned fire, but Cal was faster, expertly dodging their shots as he fired again, hitting one of the men in the shoulder. The remaining man hesitated for a moment, a flicker of fear in his eyes before he raised his rifle once more, but before he could pull the trigger, Lizzie felt the pull of her own instincts, grabbing for the revolver Cal had taught her how to use. With trembling hands she aimed and fired, the shot sending the man tumbling backward into the dirt. For a long moment there was only silence, broken only by the distant rustling of the trees and the steady sound of horses' hooves. The 3 men were on the ground, either wounded or scrambling to retreat, and Lizzie couldn't help but feel a surge of triumph. She had done it. But that triumph was short-lived as she realized the full weight of what had just happened. Cal's eyes met hers, his expression grim, his jaw clenched tight. "Clifford's not going to back off," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of the truth. "This has just become a lot more dangerous." Lizzie's heart raced as the full realization hit her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about survival. Clifford was escalating his pursuit. He would stop at nothing to drag her back to the life she had run from, and it was clear now that the stakes had risen higher than either of them had anticipated. But in that moment, as their eyes met, something shifted between them. The tension between them, thick as it had been, now carried with it the understanding that they were both in this together. This was no longer just a job for Cal, it had become personal. Lizzie nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we'll keep moving," she said, her voice steady. "I won't go back. Not now, not ever." Cal's gaze softened, and for the briefest of moments something passed between them. Something that spoke not of duty, not of bounty hunting, but of trust, and of something more that neither was yet willing to name. "Let's get out of here," Cal said, turning his horse toward the narrow trail ahead. "We've got a long ride ahead of us." As they rode off into the wilderness, the danger still hung heavy in the air. But for the first time in days, Lizzie felt a spark of hope. They were still moving forward, and as long as they were together, she could face whatever lay ahead. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that filled the otherwise quiet glade, where towering pines stretched high into the velvet sky. The soft hum of the night air rustled through the branches, and the warmth from the flames provided a brief respite from the cool mountain evening. Lizzie sat across from Cal, her legs crossed beneath her, eyes darting nervously between the flickering firelight and the man who had become both her protector and her captor. She had never felt so conflicted, so torn, as she did now. The last few days had been nothing short of a whirlwind. The close call with Clifford's men had left her shaken, but something else lingered. A need to understand Cal. He was more than just a bounty hunter, more than the man hired to bring her back. There was something in his eyes, something darker, more complicated, that had unsettled her since the moment they met. Now, with a fire casting soft shadows across his face, she knew she had to ask the questions that had been burning inside her. She stared at the flames, the flickering light dancing in her eyes as she swallowed her unease. "Why do Clifford's men hate you so much?" Cal didn't immediately respond. His face was hidden in shadow, his expression unreadable. Lizzie could tell he was considering whether to answer her question, whether to let her into the parts of him he so clearly guarded. His jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked as if he might say nothing at all. But the silence between them felt unbearable, and Lizzie found her voice again, pushing a little harder. "You've never told me why they seem to despise you. Why they're so eager to capture me," Lizzie continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's your connection to them?" Cal's eyes flickered to her, the firelight catching the edges of his face, revealing the subtle lines etched by years of hard living. His lips parted, but it took him a moment to speak. "I arrested Clifford's brother," he said quietly, his voice rougher than usual, as if the words tasted sour on his tongue. "A few years ago. For fraud. He was running a crooked operation, had a hand in some shady deals that would have ruined a lot of good people. The Allertons didn't take kindly to it. They never did." Lizzie blinked, processing his words as they sank in. Clifford's brother. The same man who had been quietly mentioned in hushed tones. The one whose actions had cast a shadow over everything in her life. She hadn't known the full extent of the Allertons' reach, or the depth of their malice, but this explained so much. She could feel the betrayal curling in her chest like a knot tightening around her heart. "So, this whole thing with me, with my father's plan, it's personal, isn't it?" Her voice trembled despite her best efforts to sound composed. "You're not just trying to bring me back because it's your job. You're doing it to get back at Clifford, to get back at the Allertons for what they did to you." Cal's eyes darkened, and he stood abruptly, his silhouette framed against the dancing light of the fire. The muscles in his jaw clenched as he ran a hand through his dark hair, frustration and something deeper flickering in his gaze. Lizzie's heart raced as the tension between them thickened, like a storm gathering on the horizon. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice low and tight. "I took the job because I needed the money, Lizzie, not for revenge. I'm not here to settle scores with the Allertons. Hell, I don't even care about that anymore." The sharp edge of his words caught her off guard, and she flinched. He didn't care? How could that be? Everything she had believed about him, the quiet, calculating man who had always kept his distance, seemed to unravel before her eyes. Was it all just business to him? Had she been nothing more than another paycheck in his eyes? Her voice cracked with the weight of her feelings. "Then why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you explain this from the start? Her gaze searched his face, looking for the man she thought she knew, but finding only the same stoic expression that hid all the things he refused to share. Cal looked at her then, his eyes softening just the slightest bit as he saw the hurt in hers. He took a deep breath, stepping back toward the fire and lowering himself onto the log next to her. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. "I didn't think you'd understand," he said at last, his voice quiet and more vulnerable than she had ever heard it. I thought it would just complicate things." Lizzie shook her head, feeling the sting of disappointment. "You never gave me the chance to understand." Her words came out more sharply than she intended, but she couldn't help it. The distance between them had grown so much over the past few days, the walls between them too high to scale. She could feel the chill of the mountain night creeping into her bones, but it was nothing compared to the chill in her heart. Was this all she was to him? A job? Just a piece in a game that didn't involve her? She had been running toward freedom, but now she wondered if she'd only been running deeper into a trap. Cal's gaze softened and he shifted closer, his tone more gentle than before. "I'm not using you, Lizzie. You have to believe that. I'm just trying to survive, same as you." His words hung in the air between them, and Lizzie met his eyes, searching for the truth there. She saw something, a flicker of sincerity, something that hinted at more than just his need to earn a living. It wasn't enough to completely erase the doubt she felt, but it was enough to make her wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more to him than she had thought. "Then why do you help me?" she asked, her voice softening. "Why not just take the money and leave me behind? You've already done your part." Cal hesitated for a long moment, the firelight dancing across his features, casting shadows that seemed to conceal his emotions. Finally he spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Because I can't leave you to face this alone. I can't just walk away from you. Not after everything we've been through." His words hit Lizzie like a rush of warmth, a rush of feeling she hadn't expected. She didn't know if she could trust him completely yet, but she knew one thing for certain. There was something between them that neither of them could deny. Something more than duty, more than a contract. It was a connection, fragile but real, and in that moment, as they sat there by the fire, a new understanding passed between them. Lizzie's breath caught, and before she could stop herself, she reached out, her hand trembling as she placed it gently on his arm. The contact was light, but it held so much more. A shared vulnerability, an unspoken promise. Cal met her gaze, his eyes steady, and for the first time Lizzie felt the walls between them begin to crumble. The distance that had once seemed so vast now felt smaller, more manageable, as if they were both beginning to move towards something new. She didn't know what the future held, or where the path ahead would lead them, but for the first time in a long while, Lizzie felt a flicker of hope. Not just for herself, but for them, for whatever this was between them. And that hope, fragile as it was, gave her the strength to keep moving forward. The wind whispered through the branches of the pines, the soft rustling of the leaves carrying a quiet melancholy into the cool night air. Above them, the sky stretched endlessly, a canopy of stars twinkling like diamonds scattered across velvet. The fire had long since dwindled, leaving only the faint glow of embers that painted their faces in soft hues of red and orange. The camp was still, save for the distant call of an owl and the occasional crackle from the remnants of the fire. Lizzie sat by the fire for a moment longer, her thoughts tangled and heavy. Before she stood and began to unfurl the bedroll she had packed, she laid it out at the far edge of the camp, deliberately distanced from where Cal had already set up his own sleeping space. She could feel the awkwardness in the air, the distance that had grown between them like a wall neither of them was willing to cross. The night had started with a tentative understanding, a fragile moment of connection. But now, as the hours stretched on, the tension between them had only deepened. Every word they spoke felt like it carried weight, and the silence between them seemed to grow louder with every passing minute. It wasn't the quiet of comfort, of companionship. It was the quiet of unresolved feelings, of thoughts unspoken. Cal was already lying down on his bedroll, his back turned to her, his body tense even in the stillness. His breathing was steady, but Lizzie could feel the invisible divide between them, a chasm of things unsaid and mistrust that had surfaced after their conversation earlier. Her heart ached, a deep, aching kind of pain that she couldn't quite put into words. She didn't understand it, not the bitterness she felt toward him for keeping his distance, nor the pull toward him that was just as undeniable. She had learned to be strong, to guard her emotions, but here, in this vast wilderness, with the wind howling in the trees and the stars watching over them, she couldn't silence the longing that rose within her. The closeness they had shared on the trail felt like a distant memory now, overshadowed by the truths that had come between them. She shifted on her bedroll, tugging the blankets tighter around her, but sleep would not come. The wind was cold against her skin, but it wasn't the chill that kept her awake. It was the quiet ache of being so close to someone and yet feeling more distant than ever before. She turned her head slightly, glancing over at Cal, his broad shoulders rising and falling in the dim light. He was still awake, she could feel it, could sense the unease in the way his body tensed at every small sound. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than she should have, the moonlight casting shadows across his features, highlighting the lines of weariness around his eyes. He looked different tonight, still, but distant, as if something had shifted inside him, just as it had in her. She wanted to say something, to break the silence, but the words were tangled in her throat. She knew that Cal was a man of few words, that his past had shaped him into someone who guarded his emotions with a fierce intensity. But Lizzie couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than he let on, that beneath the hard exterior there was a man who was just as broken as she was, just as lost. Her heart twisted with the realization. She had been running away from the very things that had defined her life, but in this wilderness, in the quiet of the night, she found herself running towards something else. Something she wasn't sure she was ready for. As if sensing her gaze on him, Cal shifted slightly, the movement drawing her attention back to him. Their eyes met in the dim light, and for a heartbeat the world around them seemed to fade away. There was a rawness in his eyes, something she hadn't seen before, and it made her breath catch in her throat. It was the same flicker of vulnerability she had glimpsed earlier, buried beneath the rough edges of the man he showed the world. It was fleeting. The moment passed as quickly as it had come, and the walls between them went up again, higher than before. Cal turned his head back toward the sky, his jaw tightening in the way it always did when he was lost in thought. Lizzie closed her eyes, willing herself to fall asleep, but the heavy silence that filled the space between them made that impossible. Her mind kept replaying their conversations, the words they had exchanged, the unspoken truths that hung in the air like a cloud neither of them could break through. Despite the distance between them, despite the walls they had both built, Lizzie could still feel him there, his presence as palpable as the air she breathed. She longed to reach out to him, to bridge the gap that had formed between them, but something held her back. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the realization that some things were too fragile to be forced, too precious to be risked. The wind howled through the trees again, a reminder of the vastness of the world around them. Lizzie turned her face toward the night sky, her eyes tracing the constellations, wondering where this journey would take them. She had once thought that freedom meant escaping the life she had been born into, but now she wasn't so sure. Was freedom something she could ever truly have, or was it just an illusion, a fleeting moment that would always slip through her fingers? Beside her, Cal's steady breathing was the only sound that kept her from falling into the spiraling thoughts that threatened to overwhelm her. He was there, just a few feet away, his presence a reminder that she wasn't entirely alone in this wild, untamed world. And yet the distance between them felt like an insurmountable chasm. With a deep sigh, Lizzie turned onto her side, pulling the blanket tighter around her, and closed her eyes. But sleep didn't come easily. Instead, the soft rustle of the trees, the distant call of the night birds, and the faint crackle of the embers reminded her of the distance she still had to cross, not just in the wilderness, but in herself. And as the night wore on, Lizzie knew that the journey ahead would be just as much about facing the unknown within her as it was about the road they would travel together. But for now, all she could do was lie awake, listening to the wind, feeling the weight of his presence beside her, and hoping that somehow the space between them would close when the time was right. Chapter 5. Confessions and Reconciliation. The journey through the rugged mountains had tested both Lizzie and her horse, pushing them harder than she'd ever expected. Every mile had felt like an eternity, the path narrow and treacherous, winding upward through rocky passes and loose gravel. It was a ride that demanded focus, every step on the uneven ground. Lizzie kept her gaze on the path ahead, her mind a swirl of conflicting thoughts. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him, Cal, to become such a constant part of her days. There had been moments in the past few days when she could almost imagine him as someone else, a companion, a fellow traveler. But the memory of his initial detachment of the job he was hired for still loomed between them. Her horse shifted uneasily beneath her, its hooves slipping slightly on the loose gravel. Lizzie tensed, gripping the reins tighter, trying to steady the animal, but the footing was uneven and the slope was steep. She felt the animal's legs give way beneath her, and before she could react, the mare lurched to the side, threatening to lose its balance. A flash of motion caught her eye, and before she could even process what was happening, Cal was there. His horse surged forward and he reached out, his gloved hand gripping the reins of her mare with practiced ease. His steadying touch kept her horse from tumbling, and in that brief moment, Lizzie felt the tension in her body ease. "Easy, girl." Cal's voice was low and calm, his tone unshakable. He gently guided the horse back onto firmer ground, never taking his eyes off the animal. Lizzie exhaled sharply, her heart still pounding from the near miss. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer than she intended. She didn't meet his gaze immediately, but she could feel his presence beside her, solid and reassuring. "You're welcome," Cal replied, his voice steady. "Keep your eyes on the ground, Lizzie. This isn't the kind of terrain where you want to let your guard down." She nodded, the words sinking in. She had been too distracted, too caught up in her own thoughts to notice how perilous the path was. Cal's reminder was not just about the physical danger, but a reminder of how he had been there for her time and time again. Steadfast, unwavering. The silence between them stretched on, but it was different now. Cal's protectiveness wasn't an intrusion. It was a subtle thread that pulled them closer together, weaving a connection that Lizzie hadn't fully acknowledged before. They continued onward, the sound of their horses' hooves the only noise that filled the air. Lizzie's mind wandered, and for the first time in days she allowed herself to consider the road ahead. Not just the physical road, but the one that lay between her and Cal. She thought of their earlier exchanges, of the mistrust and the distance that had coloured every word and every glance. But now, with every turn of the trail, the gap between them seemed to narrow ever so slightly. It wasn't just the mountain that was testing them, it was the unspoken tension that had built between them since the beginning. She glanced at him from the corner of her eye. He rode with a quiet confidence, his posture relaxed but alert, his gaze scanning the path ahead with a focus that seemed almost instinctive. His presence was undeniable, a steady force that made her feel strangely protected, despite the chaos of her circumstances. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she could continue holding on to the walls she had built so carefully around herself. Cal had saved her again, had shown her a side of himself that was unexpectedly gentle, unexpectedly steadfast. She had learned over the course of their journey that his calm, controlled demeanour was not an absence of feeling, but a way of bearing the weight of the world without burdening others. And despite her initial resistance to him, Lizzie couldn't ignore the growing recognition that his care for her was something deeper than mere duty. Her horse shifted beneath her, the ground beginning to level out as they neared a more stable section of the trail. Lizzie hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to broach the subject, but in the end she couldn't keep it to herself any longer. "You've saved me more times than I can count, Cal," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of her thoughts. "I never realized how careful you are, how skilled you are at what you do." She swallowed, unsure of what she was really trying to say. "I don't know how to thank you for that." Cal's gaze flickered to her for a brief moment, his lips pulling into the smallest of smiles. "It's just my job, Lizzie. No thanks needed." But she could hear the hint of something in his tone, something that spoke of more than just duty. There was a depth to it, a quiet acknowledgement that he wasn't just going through the motions. He had been there for her in ways that no one else had, not just as a hired guide, but as something more, a protector, even when it wasn't expected of him. Lizzie smiled to herself, the vulnerability she had kept hidden slowly beginning to soften. Maybe she hadn't been entirely wrong about him after all. Maybe this wasn't just a job to him. They rode in silence for a little longer, the mountains stretching ahead of them, the trail continuing through a series of sharp curves and rocky outcrops. But Lizzie felt the shift within her. The tension that had once defined her relationship with Cal now seemed less like an obstacle and more like the space they needed to truly understand each other. When they stopped to take a break, Lizzie took a deep breath and glanced at him. There was still so much she didn't know about him, so much he hadn't shared. But she realized something important, that it was no longer about her running away from her past. It was about the road ahead, about what she could choose in the moment, and who she could rely on. As they prepared to ride again, she found herself meeting his gaze more openly, the earlier walls between them now feeling a little more porous. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long while, Lizzie allowed herself to believe that she might be able to trust again. And maybe, just maybe, there was something real between them, something worth fighting for. The road ahead was still long, the stakes high, but Lizzie was ready for whatever came next. And she wasn't alone anymore. The dim light filtering through the cabin's cracked windows cast long shadows across the weathered wooden floor. Lizzie sat near the small hearth, the flickering flames offering a bit of warmth to the cool, quiet evening. The cabin, abandoned for what looked like years, felt strangely comforting in its solitude. The simplicity of it, just the two of them, was a reprieve from the uncertainty of the road, a moment where she didn't have to keep up the pretense of being strong or in control. Cal sat across from her, his broad frame silhouetted by the dying light, his gaze distant as he poked at the small fire. The exhaustion from the long day's ride hung heavy between them, each of them retreating into the quiet space of their thoughts, neither speaking but both aware of the other's presence. Lizzie shifted, her muscles sore from the journey, and as she moved, her gaze caught Cal's. She saw the fatigue etched into his features, the way his jaw tightened when he thought no one was watching. She had seen that look before. He was holding something in, something too heavy to carry alone. She cleared her throat, breaking the silence. "Cal," she began softly, her voice tentative yet warm, "I've been meaning to ask, why did you leave the law?" His eyes flickered up, meeting hers with a quiet intensity. His mouth tightened, the unspoken history between them lingering in the space. For a moment, Lizzie thought he might brush her question aside, but then, with a long exhale, he leaned back against the wall and let his gaze drift to the fire. "I grew up wanting to do right by people," he said slowly, his voice rough, like gravel grinding underfoot. "Thought the law was the answer. But the deeper I got into it, the more I realized that the system's rigged. It's not about justice, it's about power. People get hurt and nothing ever changes." He paused, his eyes far away. "I couldn't keep pretending it was what I believed in, so I walked away, took whatever jobs I could get to Lizzie listened intently, her heart aching for him. She had always admired Cal's quiet strength, his unshakable resolve, but now, hearing his disillusionment, she understood him in a way she hadn't before. He had fought for a cause that had betrayed him, and now he was just trying to make it day by day, "I can't imagine what that must have been like," Lizzie said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "And to see the things you believed in crumble, it's hard to know what's real anymore when everything you thought was true just fades away." Cal glanced at her, his expression unreadable for a moment, before something flickered in his eyes. "You know what I see when I look at you, Lizzie?" he asked, his voice low, the words heavy with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "I see someone who's been trapped by their own duty. Someone who had no choice in the matter, forced to play a part they never asked for." Lizzie's heart thudded in her chest, a pang of guilt twisting inside her. She had always felt the weight of her family's expectations, her duty to them, to her father, even if it meant sacrificing everything she wanted for herself. But hearing Cal say it out loud, she finally understood the depth of her own burden. "That's just it," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know how to break free. I thought if I just ran away I'd figure it out, but now I don't know what's worse. The guilt of leaving everything behind or the fear of going back." Her eyes lowered and she bit her lip, feeling the weight of her words. Cal was silent for a moment, the tension between them palpable as he watched her. Then, in one fluid motion, he pushed himself to his feet and crossed the small cabin to kneel beside her. His hand reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and his touch was gentle, almost reverent. "You're not alone in this," he said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. "You think you have to carry it all by yourself, but you don't. I've been there. I've carried my own weight for too long, and I'm tired of doing it alone." Lizzie's breath caught in her throat as his words settled over her, a quiet comfort she hadn't known she needed. She looked up at him, her heart thundering in her chest. The distance between them, both physical and emotional, seemed to disappear as he cupped her face in his rough hands, his thumbs gently brushing her cheeks. There was a softness in his eyes now, something deeper than the stoic man she had come to know. He wasn't just her protector, he was someone who understood her, someone who carried his own burdens just as she did. "You've shown me more kindness than I deserve, Cal," Lizzie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "More than I ever thought possible. I didn't know what to expect when I left, but I never imagined this." Before she could finish, Cal leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a tender, lingering kiss. It was soft at first, a gentle pressure, but it deepened as he held her closer, his arms enveloping her with a warmth that made her feel safe for the first time in ages. All the pain, all the uncertainty, all the walls she had built around her heart seemed to melt away with the warmth of his kiss. For a long moment they stayed like that, locked in each other's arms, the kiss speaking the words they couldn't bring themselves to say aloud. The world outside the cabin ceased to exist. It was just the two of them, their hearts beating in unison, their fates intertwined more than either of them could have imagined. When they finally broke apart, Lizzie's breath was shallow, her pulse racing. She looked up at him, her gaze full of the questions she had yet to ask, but in that moment she didn't need to. Everything she needed to know was in his eyes, in the way he held her, in the quiet promise of something more between them. "I'm not going anywhere," Cal murmured, his voice low and sincere. "We'll figure this out together, Lizzie." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, offering him a small, trembling smile. "Together," she whispered, and for the first time in a long while the weight of her world didn't feel so heavy. Maybe, just maybe, she could start to believe in something more, something real, something she never expected to find. The night stretched out before them, quiet and still, but filled with the warmth of a bond that neither of them had anticipated. And in that silence, Lizzie realized that the path ahead, though uncertain, no longer felt like a solitary journey. She wasn't alone anymore, and somehow, with Cal by her side, she believed they could both find the peace they'd been searching for. Lizzie's hands shook slightly as she unfolded the weathered envelope, the ink smudged by travel and time. She had not expected to receive any correspondence today, let alone one addressed to her in a familiar, flowing script. It had been weeks since they had passed through any larger settlements, and the courier, An older man who had appeared at the small trading post by the river had only come through town by happenstance. The courier had caught sight of Lizzie's name and, after a brief exchange, handed her the letter. He had recognized her last name from the small rural town where she had spent her early years. She could still feel the stranger's surprised gaze on her as he'd walked away, and the weight of the letter now pressed in her hands like a secret about to unfold. She held the letter close for a moment longer, then opened it carefully, her heart racing as the neat handwriting on the page met her eye. It was from her late Aunt Regina, the woman who had been the closest thing to a mother she had ever known and whose passing had always been a shadow in her life. Her breath caught as she read the first few lines, which offered condolences for the aunt's passing, but it was the last sentence that made her heart stop. "To my dear niece Lizzie, I leave you what little remains of my estate, a small inheritance that may offer you the means to change your life." The words seemed to blur in front of her eyes, and she blinked rapidly to refocus. A modest inheritance? Could it truly be enough to free her from the fate her father had tied her to? She read on, her pulse quickening. Her aunt had left her a modest property, some cash savings, and enough resources to allow Lizzie to live independently, without the shackles of a marriage to Clifford. The letter detailed the small estate, a country cottage just outside of town with some farmland, and a small account in her name at the local bank. It was more than Lizzie had ever dreamed possible. The weight of the moment crushed her chest. The dream of escaping her arranged fate had always felt distant, impossible, but this could change everything. She didn't need to marry Clifford to save her family. She could save them on her own. The realization took her breath away. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lizzie felt a flicker of hope. The future, her future, was hers to control once more. "Cal." Her voice trembled as she looked up from the letter, her eyes wide with astonishment. This could change everything." Cal, who had been sitting silently beside her, watching her with a quiet intensity, leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowing in curiosity. The look on his face shifted as he read the shock in her eyes, then the realization, and he sat up straighter. "Are you saying this inheritance, it's enough to save your family's business?" His voice held a note of disbelief, but it was edged with something else, something Lizzie couldn't place, but it felt like a quiet, shared moment of hope. Lizzie nodded, still staring at the letter. "It's more than enough. If I use it right, I can prevent the bankruptcy my father's facing. I don't have to marry Clifford. I don't have to sacrifice myself to save them." Her voice cracked slightly, the emotion flooding through her, and she clutched the letter tighter. "I can do this, Cal. I can save my family on my own." Cal's expression softened as he studied her, his features set in that quiet way she had come to recognize as his version of amazement. His gaze softened, something warm flickering in his eyes, and for a moment Lizzie saw a tenderness she hadn't expected. "You don't have to do it alone, Lizzie," Cal said quietly. His voice was a steady, unspoken promise that wrapped around her like the safety of a warm blanket on a cold night. "If you need help, I'm here." The weight of his words settled on her like a balm to her restless heart. She had spent so much of her life carrying the weight of her family's expectations alone, trying to balance her desires against their needs. But now, with Cal by her side, she felt a shift, a quiet connection that made her believe she wasn't alone in this, not anymore. Her eyes met his, and in that simple, shared moment she realized how much they had come to rely on one another, how much her heart had softened to him, despite everything. A soft smile tugged at her lips, and she nodded slowly, feeling a surge of warmth in her chest. "Thank you, Cal." The cabin was quiet for a while, the weight of their shared discovery still fresh in the air. Lizzie felt a surge of relief, of hope, but the storm clouds on the horizon had begun to gather, as if the world outside knew just how fragile their peace was. The tension that had followed them from the mountains seemed to linger in the air as they packed up their belongings, preparing to leave before nightfall. They had decided to head for the nearest town where Lizzie could take the steps necessary to claim her inheritance. It was a newfound sense of freedom, but the path was still treacherous, and danger was still lurking in the shadows. A distant rumble of thunder cracked through the sky, the first hint of a storm's approach, and Lizzie shivered despite herself. But the storm wasn't just in the sky. It was brewing closer. As they mounted their horses, ready to leave the cabin behind, Lizzie caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the trading post. A small group of riders, rough-looking men on horseback, had just arrived, their presence unsettling. Cal tensed immediately, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the group. Lizzie followed his gaze, her breath catching in her throat. The men were familiar. She recognized them immediately. It was the same group of thugs that had come after them before. Only now there were more of them, and their intentions seemed far less benign. "Clifford's men," Cal muttered, his voice laced with warning. "They're back." The men dismounted, speaking in hushed voices, but Lizzie could hear enough to catch the chilling words that sent a wave of dread through her. "She's worth a fortune now. Clifford won't let her get away again. We'll have to take her by force if we have to." Her blood ran cold. The inheritance, her escape from Clifford's control, was a threat to him, to everything he stood to gain. She hadn't realized just how dangerous this would become, but now the truth was undeniable. Clifford was willing to escalate things. "We need to leave, now!" Cal's voice was sharp, urgent. He grabbed Lizzie's arm and guided her toward the horses, his expression hardening. As they mounted quickly, the rumble of thunder grew louder, and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. They didn't look back as they spurred their horses into a gallop, racing into the growing storm. The road ahead was unknown, but they had no choice but to keep moving, to find safety in the mountains before Clifford's men caught up. Lizzie glanced at Cal, her heart pounding in her chest. The storm in the sky matched the one building between them. The stakes were higher now, and the danger closer than ever, but as they rode into the rain, Lizzie felt something shift inside her. They were in this together, and somehow that thought was enough to give her the strength to face whatever came next. The sound of thundering hooves echoed off the jagged cliffs as Lizzie and Cal urged their horses forward, the narrow mountain pass winding ahead like a serpent. Their breath came in ragged bursts, and the wind whipped around them with ferocious intensity. The storm that had been threatening all day had finally arrived in full force, the rain slicking the already treacherous path beneath their feet. Lizzie's heart was pounding in her chest, but her resolve was even firmer. They had come this far, too far to turn back now. She could feel the weight of the letter in her bag, the inheritance that could change everything, but she could also feel the ever-present danger of Clifford's pursuit, closing in like a shadow over her future. Cal's eyes flickered toward the horizon, his gaze sharp as he kept a firm grip on the reins. He'd been quieter than usual, his focus laser-sharp on the trail ahead, but Lizzie could sense his tension. They were being hunted, not just by Clifford's hired thugs, but by Clifford himself. He wouldn't stop until he had Lizzie back, and that knowledge clung to her like a dark cloud. "Don't let them get too close," she said, her voice steady despite the anxiety gnawing at her. Her gaze flickered nervously to the side, where the cliff edge dropped away sharply. The narrow path they were on had no guardrails, and one wrong step could send them plummeting into the ravine below. "I'll keep us on track," Cal muttered, his jaw set as his hand tightened on the reins. "We'll make it through this, Lizzie." But his words were no more than a whisper against the howl of the wind, and Lizzie knew they were both aware of the gravity of the situation. Time was running out. The path ahead was growing steeper, the narrow pass offering less and less space to maneuver, and the sound of approaching riders had grown unmistakably closer. A moment later, the first of Clifford's men appeared from behind the bend, galloping toward them with a shout. Lizzie's stomach churned, but she didn't slow down. She couldn't. Behind him, a line of riders followed, and with them Clifford himself, his figure tall and menacing as he rode at the head of the group. His eyes locked onto Lizzie's, and the cruel smile on his face made her stomach drop. "This is it," Cal muttered, pulling his revolver from his side and flicking the safety off. "Get ready." Clifford's voice rang out across the pass, cold and filled with venom. "Lizzie! You're not going anywhere!" His horse reared up and he shouted at his men. "Circle around them! Don't let them escape. The riders moved quickly, surrounding Lizzie and Cal, their horses' hooves thundering in a cacophony of chaos. The wind seemed to howl even louder as the storm picked up, rain slashing at them like 1,000 needles. The narrow pass left them with little room to move, and Lizzie could feel the panic rising in her chest. There was no way out. Cal's face was hard as stone as he moved his horse in front of hers, creating a shield between her and the men. His eyes locked onto Clifford, and for the first time, Lizzie saw something in him. Something raw. Something dangerous. The unspoken grudge between Cal and Clifford's family wasn't just business. It was personal. "You've got nowhere to run, Donovan," Clifford sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "You think you can keep her from me? She's mine. I'll burn everything to the ground to get her back." Lizzie's heart clenched at his words, and for a fleeting moment she felt the suffocating weight of her choices. But then Cal spoke, his voice low and lethal. "If you think you can have her, you'll have to go through me." Clifford's laughter rang through the pass, mocking and cruel. "I don't have time for games, Donovan," he sneered. "I'll deal with you in due time, but first—" His eyes slid to Lizzie, and the hate in them was unmistakable. "You'll regret this, Lizzie. You'll regret defying me." Lizzie could feel her chest tighten, but Cal's hand on his gun was steady. "If you touch her, Clifford," Cal said, his voice low but filled with an undeniable promise, "you'll never get another chance." The tension stretched taut between them, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She could feel the heaviness in her bones, the knowledge that this was it. This was the confrontation that would decide everything. Cal's hand tightened around the grip of his gun as he stepped closer to Lizzie, positioning himself in a protective stance. His body was an unmovable wall, his gaze fierce as it never left Clifford. Clifford's lips twisted into a cruel smile as he raised his own weapon, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can stand against me, Donovan? You're just a hired gun, nothing more. And as for you, Lizzie," he sneered at her, "you'll be nothing but a pawn until I decide what to do with you." For the briefest of moments, Lizzie's breath caught in her chest, the world narrowing to just the two men, Cal, her protector, and Clifford, her captor. She didn't know if she was more afraid of what Clifford would do next, or what it would cost her to fight back. "Let's end this," Clifford spat, his voice full of venom. Before he could move, Cal fired. The sound of the gunshot rang out, deafening in the narrow pass, the bullet whizzing past Clifford's men and striking the cliff wall beside them. The riders scattered, confusion and panic overtaking them. Clifford's eyes went wide for a moment, but then, like a switch had been flipped, his fury returned, and he raised his gun to return fire. But Cal was faster, the second shot ringing out just as Clifford's hand moved. One of Clifford's men fell, clutching his leg, and the rest hesitated. Clifford cursed under his breath, then glared at Cal with the intensity of a man who knew he had lost the advantage. "This isn't over," he hissed. "I'll make sure of it." "Not if I have anything to say about it," Cal growled, his voice deadly calm. With that, the remaining riders turned and fled, their horses scrambling over the rough terrain as they disappeared into the shadows. Clifford remained for a moment longer, his sneer lingering, but as Cal's gun stayed trained on him, he finally turned his horse and rode off, his men following. The pass was silent once more, the tension dissipating in the wake of the confrontation. Lizzie's heart was still pounding in her chest, her breath coming in shallow bursts as she looked up at Cal, who slowly lowered his gun. "Are you all right?" His voice was softer now, the fierce protection giving way to something gentler as he turned to face her. Lizzie nodded, her eyes wide but steady. She had never felt so alive, so overwhelmed by what had just happened, but the weight of Cal's protection, of his presence by her side, calmed the storm inside her. "We did it," she whispered, a rush of relief flooding through her. The words didn't feel real yet, but she knew one thing for certain. They had survived. Together. And as she looked at Cal, her heart swelling with something more than gratitude, she realized just how much he had become a part of her life, how deeply their fates had intertwined. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but in that moment Lizzie knew that whatever came next, she wouldn't be facing it alone. The air was thick with tension as the storm raged overhead, the jagged peaks of the mountain pass looming dark and forbidding in the swirling wind. Lizzie's heart pounded as she watched Cal stand tall, his focus unyielding as he faced off against Clifford's remaining men. The chaos that had erupted moments before, the sound of gunfire, the shouts, had only intensified as the storm seemed to mirror the violence unfolding on the cliffside. And then, in an instant, everything shifted. A shot rang out, the crack of thunder barely masking the sound, and Lizzie felt a searing pain rip across her side. The bullet grazed her shoulder, a sharp sting that made her stumble backward, her balance faltering as she teetered dangerously close to the edge of the cliff. Her breath caught, her vision blurring as she felt the ground slip beneath her. She reached out, desperate to steady herself, but everything felt like it was spinning. In that moment, Cal was there. With a speed and strength that left Lizzie breathless, he lunged forward, his hand catching her wrist just as her foot slipped. He yanked her back toward him, pulling her into his chest with such force that she collided with him hard. She gasped, her heart racing, but before she could take a full breath, she felt the heat of his body against hers, his arms wrapping around her in a protective embrace. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, his voice low, barely audible over the wind and the rain. His hand was already at her side, feeling for the injury. "I'm fine," Lizzie gasped, her hand pressed against the grazed wound on her shoulder, but her legs still trembled from the near fall. "But you—" Before she could finish, the sound of another shot rang out, cutting through the storm. Cal's body jerked, and Lizzie's heart stopped. "No!" she screamed, her voice cracking. She reached for him instinctively, but Cal didn't let go of her, his grip tightening around her shoulders even as he staggered backward, a grimace twisting his features. "I'm fine, Lizzie," he muttered through clenched teeth, his voice strained but still steady. "It's just a scratch." But Lizzie saw the blood, the bright red stain spreading across his shirt, and her stomach turned. Cal winced in pain, but didn't falter. With a sharp exhale, he took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he turned toward Clifford's right-hand man, who had been firing from the opposite edge of the pass. With one fluid motion, Cal drew his revolver, his face set in grim determination. "Stay back," Cal growled to Lizzie, his voice rough. "This isn't over yet." With the same fierce resolve, he took aim and fired, the shot ringing out into the storm. The man barely had time to react before he crumpled to the ground, the gun slipping from his hand as he fell. A quick, clean shot, just the way Cal had always done things. For a long moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The storm raged on, but the immediate danger had passed. The last of Clifford's men lay incapacitated on the ground, and Lizzie's heart pounded in her chest, her mind still reeling from the violence of the moment. Then, as if to confirm their fragile victory, the sound of hooves echoed from below, and 2 local lawmen appeared, alerted by the gunfire. Their horses skidded to a stop as they took in the scene, the downed men, the still-standing Cal, and the shaken Lizzie by his side. Clifford, seeing his remaining men subdued and with no further advantage, narrowed his eyes. He looked at the lawmen, then back at Cal, then at Lizzie, his eyes full of venom. Without another word, he spurred his horse and fled, disappearing into the storm, his promise of vengeance hanging in the air like a threat that would never be fulfilled. Cal took a shuddering breath as the lawmen dismounted, one of them approaching to check on Lizzie and the other moving to apprehend Clifford's men. But Cal didn't relax. His eyes were still sharp, focused, and despite the blood soaking through his shirt, his stance remained resolute. Lizzie reached for his arm, her fingers trembling, and for the first time she saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the toll of everything they had been through. He had saved her again, pulled her from the edge of death both literally and figuratively, and now, with the danger past, she could see the rawness of his pain. I thought I'd lost you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Cal met her gaze, his features softening for a moment as his hand gently cupped her cheek. The simple touch felt like everything to Lizzie, like an anchor in the storm. "You didn't lose me," he said quietly, his voice full of something unspoken, something deeper than either of them could say. "I'm not going anywhere." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Lizzie's heart swelled as she looked at him, her chest tight with relief and something more, something she had been pushing aside for too long. She knew now, in the quiet aftermath of the chaos, that she had come to rely on him in ways she hadn't understood before. He wasn't just her protector. He was her partner, her strength when she had none left. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lizzie allowed herself to lean into him, her hand reaching for his, the cool rain now falling around them. But it no longer mattered. He was there, and that was enough. As the lawmen moved to secure the area, Cal's hand tightened around hers, and in that brief moment, the world felt still. He had saved her once again, and now together they would finally find the peace they had both been searching for. And though the storm still raged overhead, Lizzie knew in her heart that this was the beginning of something new, a new path, a new future, one that was no longer defined by fear or duty, but by the choices they made together. Chapter 6. Dawn of a New Life. The small clinic smelled faintly of herbs and antiseptic, its wood-panelled walls lined with shelves of bottles and bandages. Lizzie sat by the window, watching the early morning light spill across the wooden floors, but her thoughts were focused entirely on the man lying on the bed. Cal's form was still and pale, his features softened by exhaustion, the bandages wrapped around his shoulder a stark contrast to his usual rugged demeanour. She had never seen him this vulnerable before, his strong, confident self reduced to someone who needed care, who relied on her for comfort and safety. It was a humbling realization, and the care she took in tending to his wounds was far more than just physical. It was an emotional balm for both of them, a quiet understanding that had begun to blossom between them in the wake of all they had faced. Her fingers moved gently over the edges of his bandages, adjusting them carefully as Cal's eyes fluttered open. He blinked slowly, his gaze locking with hers as he took in her face, the faintest trace of a smile pulling at his lips, despite the pain that still lingered in his eyes. "You should be resting," Lizzie murmured, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, her touch soft and reassuring. She could feel his warmth beneath the layers of the sheets, and it steadied her, grounding her in the moment. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice hoarse and thick with the haze of pain medication. His eyes were still hazy, but there was a tenderness in them as they locked on hers. "I don't need rest. Just you." The words hung in the air, and Lizzie's heart gave an unexpected lurch. She tried to focus on his injury, but the vulnerability in his voice, in the way he looked at her, made it impossible to ignore the growing tension between them. A breath caught in her throat as she looked down at him, her fingers lingering on the bandage. "Carl," she whispered, her voice trembling with something she couldn't quite name. "You've been through so much. I never wanted to turn you in, Lizzie." His words were slow, heavy with the weight of his confession. "When I first took the job, I thought it was just business, but the longer I spent with you, the more I realized I couldn't do it. I couldn't be the man who took you back to that life." He paused, a grimace of pain passing over his face, but he continued, his voice softer now. "I love you, I always have, and I want a future with you, no matter what that looks like." The words echoed in the quiet room, and Lizzie froze, her hand hovering over his chest. The intensity of his confession overwhelmed her, and for a moment everything else fell away. She had feared that Cal might never feel the same, that his duty to the job and his past might keep him from seeing her for the woman she had become. But now, in the soft light of the small room, there was no denying the truth between them. She swallowed hard, her emotions swirling in a mixture of relief, joy, and disbelief. You love me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," he answered, his voice steady despite the fog of the painkillers. "I've loved you for a long time, Lizzie, and I can't imagine a life without you. No matter what happens, we'll find a way to make it work. Together." A heart swelled in her chest, and without thinking she leaned down, brushing her lips against his forehead in a soft, tender kiss. It was a kiss full of everything they had been through, the trials, the hardships, and the hope that now stood between them like an unspoken promise. "I love you too, Cal," Lizzie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And I want to build a future with you too." The words felt like the beginning of something new, something uncharted, but entirely there. They didn't need the promises of a perfect future, they just needed each other. Several days passed, and though Cal's recovery was slow, his strength returned with each passing hour. Lizzie focused on the legalities of her inheritance, meeting with local officials and making the arrangements to secure the property. She had been prepared for the uncertainty of the future, but now, with Cal by her side and the new possibilities ahead, she found herself filled with an unexpected sense of peace. As the day wore on, a familiar figure appeared at the door of the clinic, his face drawn and weary. Winston Prescott, Lizzie's father. His clothes were dusty from travel, and his posture was less rigid than it had been in the past. Lizzie felt a pang of something she couldn't quite place, as she saw him stand in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on her. "Father," Lizzie said, rising slowly from her chair, her voice tight with the mix of emotions she had kept bottled up for so long. "What are you doing here?" Winston's gaze softened slightly, though there was still a trace of the stern man she had always known. He stepped forward, and for a moment there was an awkward silence between them. "I've been thinking about everything, Lizzie," he said, his voice lower than usual. "About you, about the business, about the life you've had to carry for so long." He hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "I was wrong to think I could control your future. I see that now." Lizzie's heart ached as she listened to her father's words. This was the first time she had ever heard him speak with such vulnerability, such regret. The man who had always seen her as a means to an end was now standing before her, acknowledging that she had the right to make her own choices. "I've come to accept that this inheritance is yours," Winston continued, his voice steady but humbled. "And if it can help you save the business without marrying Clifford, then I will support you. Your happiness has always mattered more than anything else, but I failed to see that until now." Lizzie blinked, her emotions surging, and for the first time in a long while she felt a tear slip down her cheek. It wasn't the weight of the past that broke her. It was the weight of finally being seen, of finally being heard. "Thank you, Father," she whispered, her voice breaking as she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, holding on to the man who had shaped so much of her life, but who was now offering her the freedom she had longed for. Later that evening, as the sun began to set in the west, Lizzie and Cal stood side by side, their hands clasped tightly as they watched the golden light spill across the horizon. The storm had passed, and the future seemed as vast and open as the land before them. The road ahead would not be without its challenges, but as they stood together, two people who had fought for their right to choose their own paths, Lizzie knew that, together, they could face anything. With a final glance at the settlement behind them, Lizzie swung herself up onto her horse, Cal following suit, and together they rode off into the distance, their hearts full of hope for the life they would now build, hand in hand. The adventure was just beginning, and for the first time in her life, Lizzie felt ready to face whatever came next, with Cal by her side.